Cold Hit, the third book, was based in large part on a killer who was a very prominent art dealer in New York. And it appalled me and also fascinated me that someone who could be in the center of the art world, I mean, a major celebrity, who later was implicated in a very high-profile homicide and went to jail, went to federal jail for death threats and kidnapping and coercion. And that, his case took me into the art world. I went from his gallery to begin to research the whole art space in Chelsea and the history down there and the High Line Railroad that runs right through these art galleries and is now being converted into a park. And it just became sort of a feed from what we talked about earlier. I just didn't like doing a thriller and having no guts to it. So I began to unlayer places that looked benign to me. Roosevelt Island in the Dead House with these historic institutions built in the middle of the 19th century. And the Bone Vault, I think, is my favorite, with the Museum of Natural History and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and their very dark histories, their beginnings. I mean, these are the first museums that any kid goes to in New York or as tourists, and they both have a very, very dark history. So they're creepy inside and underneath, despite the fun of one and the elegance of the other. And I just like to do it.
Have you seen, I think his name is Danny Danziger, although I may have this wrong. He has just put out a book about the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's Gloria Guggenheim's son, which I presume is one reason he was able to do this book. It's an interview with maybe 40 people who work at the Metropolitan, all the way from trustees and the director to the head of security, and some guys that pack art, you know, to ship and all that. Boy, that's an interesting subject.
Right.
Whoa, real interesting insurance questions there. And the cleaner and, you know, the curators and all the rest of it. But I kept going, the whole book, I kept thinking, all right, who's going down in the tunnel?
Right.
You know, and there was a guy who was kind of responsible for the physical maintenance, but he never mentioned it. But I always think of that because I go there a lot.
Yes, yes.
And I always think of it after I've read your book.
Well,
you know?
I mean,
the tunnels, I mean, is what I think of. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I talk to many of the people. I will read his book with interest because the history, I mean, both of those museums across Central Park from each other were established at the same time.
Right.
And the Natural History Museum, those being called then Cabinets of Curiosity, were just considered by the elegant, swell New Yorkers, looking down their nose, just vulgar collections of dead insects and dead animals that were stuffed, rocks and butterflies. And the Met founders were trying to imitate, of course, the Louvre and the great art museums of Europe. And basically, as we've come to see in recent years, we're stealing antiquities. We're coming back would take these grand trips and come back with treasures that are now being restored to Greece and Italy, you know, centuries later. And so the people at the Natural History Museum used to say, well, these guys are just stealing everything and pillaging after every war, and that's how the great art collections were established. So, of course, I never stopped to think about it, but the rivalry was so much fun between the museums, and what is in the vaults of each of them, what's deep beneath the ground, there are a lot of surprises there. So I will look forward to reading his interviews.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy it. I actually mentioned to my sister, who's recently retired from the Museum of Modern Art, that a mama really ought to have a book like that.
Yes.
It would be completely fascinating, and also she knows how the museum really works.
Yes.
Having run it. So I think she could do an interesting, some of his interviews I frankly thought were superfluous. And I would love to have seen the book done by somebody who was better acquainted with the actual workings of the museum. But still, you know, it's a whole city. And one of the interesting things is what they did with security after 9/11. You know, they closed down the museum like a shot because nobody knew whether it was going to be next. I've often speculated on how much life would have been lost if one of those planes had simply come down on Fifth Avenue.
Right. Oh,
you know, I mean, the loss of life was horrendous where it was, but the loss of life really would have been tremendous if the plane had pancaked down somewhere like that.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And of course, I always think of the school trip, the big threats afterwards. It's just every day you watch the buses unload thousands of school children, and what a horrible target that would be. And the museums and the great institutions like the museums in New York suffered terribly in the months afterwards because security was such an enormous issue, and I think are only beginning in any way to recover.
Absolutely. You can't check anything anymore. I still remember I was going to meet my sister to see a show at the Met, and my plane was late, and it wasn't even a big suitcase. I had a suitcase, and there was at the Stanhope Hotel, which I think is now condominiums, they wouldn't let you, if you weren't a guest there, they were not going to accept anything into luggage.
Right.
The museum won't accept anything.
Drop it at my place.
Well,
on up for a cup of tea.
but no, I'm really serious. I mean, the world has changed in ways. There are convenience things and all that were given up, and especially in a place like New York where moving around is difficult.
Yes.
It used to be that you could stash stuff, so that might be. I probably thought that would be an interesting thing to explore.
It is.
As a crime novelist, is how to cope with that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Well, you obviously have had a good time. Let's talk about Bad Blood, just for laughs. What is the aspect of the city that you're delving into, literally delving into in this book?
Well, it couldn't be more different flying in over Phoenix and Scottsdale, but at the same issues because, where do you get water? I mean, it's something you people think about all the time, I assume, or did at some point in the desert.
If only. We often wonder if our city fathers are even considering it as one more development is licensed. I mean, it's a huge problem, but you're right. The water delivery system is a huge issue.
And so I was among the many spoiled New Yorkers and began to check my friends for ignorance. There was a fabulous story in the New Yorker magazine 3 years ago by David Gran, who is the son of Phyllis Gran, editor
from Putnam. Right.
And the photograph from it riveted me, and it was this photograph within a tunnel, very dark, water you could see seeping through what looked like what is bedrock, and men in very brightly colored slickers and rain boots and hard hats, and I thought they were in a cave somewhere. And caption, water tunnel number 3, if we don't complete this water tunnel under New York soon, there will be no water. When New York was settled in the 17th century, for the first 200 years, there were streams and ponds everywhere, the largest of which was where the courthouse complex that I worked in for 30 years now sits. Not long after, polluted and paved over, by the late 19th century, all our water came from miles away, the Catskill Mountains and the Delaware Water Gap.
There's a great reservoir or something up there.
There's a great reservoir in Westchester, and that's fed from further away. So the water comes to New York from 200 miles, the same way the Romans built aqueducts, tunnels that by gravity drop down. And somehow, when you turn your faucet on the 25th floor, it comes up to you. I never really understood how. But the 2 water tunnels that have carried water for more than a century, almost as large as this room, I mean in height and diameter, the valves are so corroded that they cannot any longer be opened and closed. So if something happened, if there was a need to turn off a valve, they can no longer turn it on again, and the entire city of New York would have to be evacuated. So the new water tunnel, started in the 1980s, will not be complete till 2020. It is considered the greatest feat of modern engineering. It attracted my attention because it's 60 stories beneath the streets of New York City. It is as deep in the bedrock as the Rainbow Room at Rockefeller Center is above the streets of New York.
So it's under the
way
the ocean
under every
and
other
the rivers and everything going around New York, right?
Yes. And it's wet. I assumed it would be dry like a cave. It's wet because the Hudson River seeps through that bedrock and just drips. And the men who built it, it's a union, very tight brotherhood, fraternal brotherhood, very hard to get in, father to son to cousins and nephews, built the Brooklyn Bridge, and were written about in David McCullough's book, The Great Bridge. And they're called sandhogs because way under the river, below the water and the mud and the silt, is sand, and that's, many of them died getting the structure, the foundation, into the sand. Well, sandhogs don't like women in their tunnels. They're entirely superstitious. So I knew it was a place Coop had to go. I knew something bad would happen to a woman down there.